Okay, the topic is Megantic County's early copper mining companies, and for many of you, you wonder, where is that? Well, we're in Canada, in Quebec, in what is called the Eastern Townships. Megantic County, I like the sound of it, but it's really an anachronism because the county wasn't created until 1855. And then in the 1980s, they reorganized public administration and the county's gone. But most of you have heard about the county because there was a train of oil tankers that caught on fire and burned down downtown Lake Megantic maybe 10, 15 years ago, right on the border with Maine. But I'm interested in mining companies there and a particular piece of legislation that has me perplexed. And I did a presentation on this at Bishop's University thinking, okay, there's a lot of Canadian historians and they will tell me, look, read this or that and your questions will be answered. Anyway, this is the Harvey Hill mine, become clear later, and we're looking toward the east. Next slide. Okay, so in the top right-hand corner, just almost out of sight is Quebec City. On the left is Montreal, and I'm interested in the township that is identified there as Leeds. There's an arrow pointing to it. And I'll also make reference to the township of Inverness and the Megantic mine. Basically, I'm looking at a series of mines at the Harvey Hill site, all of which were investments of the James Douglas family, not of the James Douglas of Arizona, but of his dad, Dr. James Douglas. And so there's been a series of companies. I mentioned Megantic because that's where Dr. James Douglas got his start. And there's been a history I'm going through of reorganization, refinancing, continual problems with lack of operating capital. But think of this as the prequel to the James Douglas that most of you may know about. Next slide. Okay, Harvey Hill used to be in Leeds Township. It's now in St. Pierre de Broughton. Again, reorganizing in Quebec as the balance between the French world and the English world changes. But this is sort of a side, small component of research that many of you have had you have tolerated my trying to figure out a number of things dealing with James Douglas's trip to Chile. And this is part of trying to understand how James Douglas of Arizona came to copper metallurgy. And those companies that I listed, they all faced the high risk and they were pinning their success to mining what we would call today low-grade primary copper sulfides. And the early work at Harvey Hill is this prequel to the Hunt Douglas copper process. And if before we were looking west, now we're looking east, and the mining was up on the hill, the entire hill has been reclaimed, and there is now a company that has drilled the whole thing, and they're looking to keep working the deposit. Next slide. This is just a little bit of orientation. This comes out of a prospectus of the Leeds Mining and Smelting Company that never amounted to anything, but it shows on the left-hand map relative to Quebec City, kind of where Harvey Hill is. I'm always annoyed with maps that don't put north at the top. So this has north to the left. On the right-hand map, it shows 3 copper outcroppings. And the original work that I'll talk about in a minute in the Inverness Township, the Megantic mine, was an extension of the outcrops. Didn't turn out, but the area that is marked with kind of an orange thing, that was the property, the land that was owned outright by a series of companies working Harvey Hill. I guess that's all there. Next slide. So the mining at Harvey Hill, all of the early references just say copper, that there was copper ore at Harvey Hill, there was copper ore in Megantic County, and there was no distinction between oxides, pyrites, sulfides, there are no carbonates. It was just copper ore. And the original enthusiasm had to do with the surface secondary ore, enriched ore, that some of the samples they had was 60, 70% copper. And so that, in an era of ignorance about copper geology, created great enthusiasm. We know now the mine is primarily bornite, but they kept looking for rich lodes, and as opposed to working profitably, which maybe they could have, the sulfide ore, they kept looking for a home run as opposed to settling for a single. And they were sinking shafts all along the outcrop and digging at its tunnels between the shafts as an exploration technique. And I at the bottom mentioned that James Douglas, the metallurgist, believed had they given up exploration and just worked with what they had, the business could have survived. Next. Now I'm shifting a little bit now to the politics, because what I'm interested in is the interface between creating a business and coping with the risk and the uncertainties of mining. The period I'm interested in Canadian history is known as the Province of Canada era. It was being run primarily by a legislative council. There had been rebellion and rioting in the 30s, kind of a French-English thing, and it led to a creation of a new legislative assembly that began in 1841. In 1867, Canada changes again and becomes a more independent federation. In Canada, they call it the start of confederation. But this government, starting in 1841, began to focus on economic development. One of their measures, not mentioned on the slide, is the creation of the Beauport Asylum, which was a monopoly insane asylum for the province, insane asylum term of the period, of which Dr. James Douglas was the owner and administrator with partners, and it allowed him a very good income. He would typically spend the winters in Egypt over the 1850s. Also during this time, they began to then promote the study of the geology in order to create investment, and they took a look at business law to help encourage investment. And this is just a profile I threw in of the Harvey Hill mine, of along at it, and some of the shafts that were dug. Next. Okay. It's a common thing in people writing about business that all modern business in at least the market countries are based upon incorporation, creating fictitious people. They never die. They can sign, the company can then sign contracts and persist over time, own property. But what was controversial in the 1830s, 40s, 50s in England, and to a lesser extent in Canada, and not much at all in the United States, was adding limited liability. And the particular question had to do with whether or not, if something goes wrong and debts remain unpaid, do the company owners have to pay the debts? With limited liability, presumably, once the money's gone, that's it, and the shareholders do not have to pay any money. That made things much safer for people investing. In none of the countries or the states of the US did limited liability joint stock companies or corporations create all at once. In all of them, and in Canada, there's a series of amendments and adjustments over time. Next. So again, repeating some of these notions, but what was emerging at the time was this idea, and in the debates in England, they're very clear. If the state created limited liability in order to protect the capitalist from risk, what was the state going to do to protect workers from risk? And some of the lords in the debates in the 1850s in the United Kingdom were very concerned that what was done for the capitalist should be done for the worker. Of course, we know the answer, which was nothing was done to protect the worker from risk until much, much later. Next. So how a business get corporate status? In the United Kingdom and Canada, up until 1850, you could get corporate status by presenting a private bill to Parliament or the Canadian Legislative Assembly. That meant it was expensive, you had to have contacts, and it was fairly few companies ever did it. In 1850, Canada, following the earlier example of New York State, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, created a business law to create corporations with limited liability. But it was a routine process. You would get that only by filing papers, much the way things are done now. Next slide. The reason it matters is the concern about unpaid debts. The bottom paragraph that was in the minds of English and to a lesser extent in Canada, the cost book system of Cornwall and Devon, where oversimplifying it, weekly or monthly earnings were distributed to the partners, and if it was a bad week or month, partners were expected to pay in. And in many of the debates in England, there was the example given of a farmer given one share of a mining company on his property, and things went bad and there were a lot of unpaid debts, and the farmer lost everything, even though he only one share out of thousands. So that was the concern in England about what happens if things go very bad. Okay, next slide. And this is just an example of legislative history. By and large, it's the standard, the same as in the United States and England. In Canada, a first reading, a bill is presented. A second reading is when it goes to committee and amendments may or may not be proposed. A third reading is the passing, and in Canada then, rather than the executive signing, it's the king or queen. This is all in the period of Queen Victoria and termed royal assent. But in this 1849 bill, which I'll show in a moment was the 1850, it was by registration. So note I have the arrow going to provision for the registration and declaration and duplicate before the registrar of the county. That was the key component that was going to make things easier so everyone could incorporate rather than presenting bills. Next. Unfortunately, some of the citizens in Canada, and specifically Montreal, were unhappy with something that was being proposed in 1850, so they burned down the legislative building. Perhaps it would be a bit like June or January 6th in 2021 in the United States. But because they burned down the building with no backups, the incorporation legislation had to start from scratch. And that's why it's an 1850 bill. And again, it's the registration part. Next. So what is interesting about this bill is that there's a series of provisions which, if someone were really interested, you could get a copy of this to read it at your leisure. The directors of the company would be liable for all unpaid debts if they didn't follow the specifications of the law, if they paid out dividends just prior to bankruptcy, or if they were giving loans to stockholders that were tied to bankruptcy. The overall concern was there is the potential for corporations, for the management, for the directors to be involved in fraudulent activities, that they would create the corporation to milk the shareholder and then just wind it up, so that under the Canadian law of 1850, directors were liable for all debts. Next. We're shifting now back to Harvey Hill. Sir William Logan was the director of the Geological Survey. He was the one that figured out that the coal in Wales and everywhere comes from ancient plant life and so on. But he was certain that the eastern townships, and particularly Megantic County, were going to become eventually the equivalent to Cornwall in England. Am I getting a count? I keep hearing a clip. Okay, nothing from Eric. Okay, next. So the steps leading to the Harvey Hill copper mining. The first company to be created was the Megantic Copper Mining Company adjoining, and it was in working with this company that it was discovered the outcroppings that led to eventually Harvey Hill. So the same organizers, the leader of which was Dr. James Douglas, they first formed the Lower Canada Mining Company. A bill was presented to incorporate it, never went further. Then they introduced a new bill in parallel with Megantic Mining for the Quebec and St. Francis Mining and Exploring Company. Next. This is the advertisement that was published in probably 15 different newspapers in the United Kingdom, really Scotland and England. In May of 1852, it appeared 3 times in the Mining Journal. Henry English, the editor at the time, said, "This looks like a good deal. There's all reputable people involved in it." They were going to capitalize then for £125,000, which was a lot of money then, and it's huge now if we were to bring it forward. £100,000 was going to the owners of the land, leaving $25,000 for operating. Interesting, colorful story. All of that falls apart. Next. Next. Okay. The Quebec St. Francis Company, that's organized to work at Harvey Hill. But now the capital is being proposed as much more reasonable in relation to what was asked originally for the adjoining Megantic County. And then in 1856, they further reduced the authorized capital. Next. This is the incorporation bill, just sort of a show and tell to give an idea. But in the bill, let me remind, the legislation allowed for registration, but this company at Harvey Hill was being incorporated by a private bill. They were not filing papers. And the bill, which makes the legal status, is making very clear that no shareholder shall be in any way liable. And there's no mentioning of a special exception for directors. So the directors, as well as any shareholders, are free of any responsibility. Next. During this period, I looked at from 1852 to 1866. Private bills for mining companies, 88 were presented, 77 finally got royal assent, and 11 were just kind of dropped. Canadian companies incorporated in the United Kingdom under the Joint Stock Companies Act of 86. There was just one. The English and Canadian Mining Company, which when it incorporated in 58, was replacing the Quebec and St. Francis Company. And all of the original stockholders were folded in, and they were getting additional English capital. Mining companies incorporated by filing a statement, 0. Companies of any kind filing a statement, I cannot find any. In going through the legislative journal, there's canal companies, bridge companies, masons, everyone's incorporating by bills. I can find no evidence that anyone ever filed papers to incorporate, although the literature on incorporation in Canada mentions the law as if it actually became viable. Next. Okay, Megantic County's early copper mining companies and the Act. The Act allowed or called for facilitation of incorporation, no instance of it ever being used. I think it may have been the board of directors not wanting to be possibly liable for responsibility. It's also possible the government never established a regulatory regime. I don't know. I'm not wanting to do a history of Canadian stuff, but I'm thinking it's more the liability specification. The English Parliament, when they passed their legislation in 1856, don't lay it all on the directors if something bad happens. And then I have this phrase at the end, whatever path taken by mining companies to incorporate, it was always about controlling liability exposure for shareholders and the directors, while at the same time bolstering confidence in the company by the outside investor. Okay, next. Now we're getting close. Wait, back one. Okay, that's it. Yeah, next. So this is it. There's a lot more, but had James Douglas Singular not put all of his savings in a single company, this is a man who owned at one time probably 36,000 acres in the eastern townships. He would go every year to Europe for 6 months with his son. For Canadian standards at the time, he was very, very well off. But he kept thinking, if we just invest a little bit more, there's going to be a rich load, you know, another meter deeper or another meter down another yard, I guess, at the time. But he might have remained solvent. And his son, had his dad not put everything and then lost it, Douglas wouldn't have gone into copper mining. He would have been a Presbyterian minister, or maybe I think he would have liked to have been a librarian or a writer, but he had no preparation for going into mining and metallurgy. in his unfinished autobiography, I have this quote from him that he wrote, I think it was around probably 1910, 11, 12, 13. He felt compelled to save, if possible, something from the wreck of his father's fortune, or at any rate paying the creditors. And he went on to explain in this obliged me to learn something of mining and metallurgy, and thus commenced my practical education in pursuits which I would not voluntarily have chosen for my life work. So all of this is part of a project. Unfortunately, it's taken a long time, but I keep finding things that are interesting that I want to look at. But it's about Douglas going to Chile in 1871 with hydrometallurgy. And as it turns out, the ore in Chile where he went to apply his process is very similar to that at Harvey Hill. So I guess that's all I have to say today. So that's it.
All right.